afternoon. Welcome to the 2022 Australian Gender Economics Workshop Policy Symposium on the policies necessary to ensure a gender equitable COVID normal economy. My name is Kristen Sobek, and I'm the chair of the AGU 2022 Organizing Committee, and I'm also a research fellow at the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute at the Australian National University. Before getting started today, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we are meeting today and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. One of Arlie Hochschild's books, entitled The Second Shift, describes the dynamics of women in dual income households, where women undertake more childcare and household work than their partners, despite their paid employment. If the pre-pandemic world already included 2 shifts for women, the impact of the pandemic is more aptly entitled the first, second, and third shifts. Those seeking overtime pay or sleep need not apply. With respect to the first shift, paid employment, the pandemic disproportionately impacted women in Australia because the industries and occupations in which they worked were hardest hit. Women were also overrepresented in part-time work, where they were more likely to lose hours, and casual work, where they were often ineligible for JobKeeper. The second shift, unpaid household work and care, continued to be predominantly undertaken by women, while the third shift, home and care responsibilities normally assumed by society, such as childcare and schools, only added to the load. Underpinning all 3 shifts was the increased mental load assumed by women for these added tasks. The weight of this increased mental load was also compounded by the elimination of the physical boundaries, workplaces, schools, homes, separating these shifts from each other. These shifts describe some, but not all of the ways in which women were impacted by the pandemic. Some of these effects continue to play out today as we learn and adapt to living with the virus. Today, we are joined by an incredibly distinguished panel who will provide their views on the policies necessary to ensure a gender equitable COVID normal economy. We'll discuss 3 issues. First, we'll consider how the pandemic has changed policy priorities regarding gender equality. Second, we'll turn to some specific policies needed by particularly disadvantaged groups. And finally, we'll discuss the gendered impact of ongoing workplace shortages and close contact and quarantine rules. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Alicia Payne is the Federal Member of Parliament for Canberra. Claudia McLean is the Principal Solicitor at the Women's Legal Centre, ACT. And Danielle Wood is the CEO of the Grattan Institute and President of the Economic Society of Australia. Finally, before we get started, just a reminder to the audience to please send through your questions via the Q&A, and by liking the questions in the Q&A, it upvotes those questions so I know which questions are most popular and can direct them to the panelists at the end of the session. So let's get started. As economists, we agree that resources are scarce and prioritization is necessary. Alicia, let's focus on how the pandemic has changed our policy priorities regarding gender equality in Australia. Prior to the pandemic, what did you view as the top 2 policies that would have contributed most to gender equality, and have those changed now?
Thanks very much, Kristen, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel today. It's an honour to be with each of you on here for this really important discussion and timely discussion. It's really hard to narrow it down to 2 things. So I might sort of try and do a politician thing and squeeze about 17 answers into 2 themes or something like that. But I do think everything that was important before the pandemic has only shown just how important it is. I think the pandemic has shown where some of our policies are failing, and the pandemic has shown where there are gaps that need to be filled to ensure that women do have equality in the workplace and the home. And that's probably a good way to split it up. I think something that I have usually said, I think, is if you did have to, well, one of the key things, as I say, it's really hard to say there is just 1 or 2 things, but I think normalising taking time out of the workforce to care for children and other family members and loved ones making that normal for both men and women, both when a child is born, but in the longer term, making part-time work more normalised for both sexes. I think that is really, really key. And I think the pandemic and the fact that when the pandemic, like part of that I think is around, there's two parts to that. Policies to support leave, particularly, strengthening our policies for women to take parental leave, but also for men. And the cultural change that needs to happen in the workplace and among employers to support that, but also just for men to be able to take that up and feel supported in that, I think is really important. And what we've seen in the pandemic is we have been forced to get better at flexible work. Of course, it's a double-edged sword, I think, for balancing work and family. In some ways, it's excellent. There are some really good parts of doing things from home that we can, cutting back on travel. In other ways, as myself and probably many of us have learned, you cannot actually care for children and work at home at the same time. It's very stressful. So I think that there is more that we need to do there. And around the parental leave, and I know this is something that Danielle has done some fantastic work on, so she may be better to talk about it than me, but we have a government scheme for parental leave for women. It's 18 weeks at the minimum wage. Labor's platform is to get that to 26 weeks with superannuation. That's a really important change that I think we need to keep fighting for. And we currently have 2 weeks for men, dad and partner pay, it's called, and I would really like to see that strengthened. However, at the moment, there's not a great take up of that among men either, just for that 2 weeks. And part of it may actually be that it is too small, and so it's more like a little break. And also it's hard for families, if the man is the main breadwinner, to live on the minimum wage even just for that 2 weeks. So there's a lot of work we can do there. On the other side of it, I think there are broader workforce issues around wages and industrial relations that women are most represented in insecure work, in casual work, in underpaid work. And the pandemic has really shown us how important that is. So, and the impacts of that when people don't have secure work and what that can mean. And all of this, of course, flows into the longer term impact of women being more likely to be in poverty in their retirement age years and throughout their life. So, there are policies there. I won't go into all the detail, but Labor has actually committed to policies around making work more secure, around closing the gender pay gap, and around wages for all Australians. And there are things that governments can do around those things, absolutely, in the law and in policy. And so those are really important things. And underpinning all this as well is affordable childcare, incredibly important for both parents, and also to make that conversation where parents are deciding who's going to go back to work and for how long. The more affordable it is, the less that discussion will fall on usually the lower paid partner, which is usually the mother. So I think that's really important. Sorry, I feel like I've talked a long time, but happy to expand on any of those things.
Thank you, Alicia, for your very insightful comments. Danielle, I'm going to turn the floor to you and ask you exactly the same question. What did you view as the top 2 policy priorities that would have contributed most to gender equality in Australia prior to the pandemic, and have those changed?
Thank you. It's a great question. I was actually remembering back to before the pandemic, which seems like a really long time ago. But when I think about what we were talking about then, and we were talking about particularly the affordability of childcare and parental leave, and the reason that we focused on those at Grattan was really when we started to look at the data around this question of the sort of lifetime earnings gap between men and women. What really jumps out is just how much that gap opens to, I think we're calling it a chasm, when children are born. So you kind of have a small gap pre-children, you have a small gap between men and women that don't have children, But between men and women that do have children, there is just this extraordinary opening up. So, what happens at that point in people's lives? Women will typically be the ones to take time out to care for the child when they're very young. Then they'll typically be the ones to be more flexible on hours after that. So what policy interventions might make a difference? Alicia has touched on them. So more affordable childcare is a really important piece of the puzzle. It is women that tend to flex their hours, as Alicia said. Not always because they're the lowest paid. In fact, in about a third of families, the women are higher paid before children. But so this goes to show, how deeply cultural some of this is. It's still, even in the vast majority of those cases, it's still the woman that will be flexing her hours. And on the current subsidy arrangements, what we see is, right across the income distribution, in most cases, it's just there's simply no financial incentive for working beyond 3 days a week, and for some cases for working at all. So, if a woman with 2 children in care was looking at going from 3 to 4 days a week, she would find that, she might be losing 80, 90, even 100%, or even paying to work for that extra day. So I do not think it is surprising that we do have this sort of cluster of people with younger children working 2 to 3 days a week, because that is absolutely where the financial incentives are pushing them. So some people may make that choice anyway, but I think it should be a choice. And if people want to work more, there should be a financial incentive to do so. That I kind of think of it as the complementary policy that goes along with that is parental leave, because obviously, if women are going to take on more paid work, then you need to have a much more equal sharing of the unpaid load. And at the moment, that's extremely gendered in this country. So we actually stand out when you do international comparisons. Australian women, do relatively more unpaid work compared to men, and relatively less paid work compared to men compared to most other countries, with Korea and Japan being the only more gendered advanced economies. So it's worth thinking about. Policy isn't obviously the only thing that matters here, but policy does help shape culture. And that's why I do think that idea of more generous leave but more gender equal leave is really important. So that what we see from around the world is the kind of the use it or lose it component for fathers and partners can be a really important driver of behaviour. I think Alicia's right, that 2 weeks just isn't enough, and it's just not worth it for people, and particularly if they have to interact with the Centrelink system for the first time. You kind of need 6 weeks or more is what my kind of review of the international literature suggests. Once you have that 6 weeks, though, you do see that men start to take it up. And the really cool thing is when we can now look around the world and see what's happened where men have been more actively involved in care in those early years. And what you clearly see is they're more involved in year 1 and 2 of the child's life. They're more involved at age 5 and more involved in age 10. So you do see that, and they're more involved in housework as well. Woohoo! So you do get that kind of more equal sharing of the unpaid load, and there's kind of emerging evidence that does support greater workforce participation for women as well. So I think of those two policies as complementary, and I think probably the two biggest things that governments can do to make a difference to that chasm. In terms of what's changed with the pandemic, and this might not have changed, it's probably just that it's just become a lot more visible to me and hopefully others in the policy world, I think, is just this question of pay and conditions in the care sector. So, I'm talking particularly here about things like aged care and childcare and disability care. Those workforces are 90% women. They are very poorly remunerated, and it's quite sort of shocking really to look at the comparative wage rates. There were already challenges with attraction and retention of workers in those sectors pre-COVID. They have been magnified by COVID, and they are going to get bigger over time because those sectors are in such high and growing demand. So I think it's made those workforces and the incredibly important and valuable work they do very visible, and that's made this issue of the way in which we treat workers in those sectors come up to front of mind for me, at least, in terms of policy priorities. And I'm just going to sneak one more in if I could, because we do have a kind of nerdy audience, an economics audience here, and this isn't going to cost any money, so I'm not forced to trade it off against my other policies. But I would just say I would love to see some revise thinking on how we do stimulus. So the standard playbook for fiscal stimulus has been give money, infrastructure spend. So money is good. Infrastructure has never actually been particularly good because it tends to hit the economy like quite late. So for example, a lot of the sort of shovel-ready projects that have been funded will be hitting next year, long after they were really needed. Social housing spending is probably the one exception to that because you can roll it out a bit faster. And this time around, like, it just didn't make sense. This was a services-led recession. We actually had a very full pipeline of infrastructure projects. There wasn't any need for stimulus in that sector. And this is going to be an ongoing issue over time. So the economy has changed a lot since the 80s and 90s. We now have 8 out of 10 workers in the services sector. So next time we have a recession, we need to be able to think about how to support jobs, and that means having to do something for services as well. So being more creative in supporting private sector services jobs through things like vouchers, but also trying to find interesting and creative ways to boost government service provision jobs temporarily and ways that deliver things of long-term value. So one example during this pandemic was the tutoring program that's been rolled out in New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia to help students catch up on lost learning. It's employed, pre-service teachers, teachers that might have been out of the workforce, and they're out there doing small group tutoring and trying to boost student learning outcomes. So more of those types of things, I think, is what we should be thinking about now, because obviously once the recession hits, you've got to be ready to go.
Thank you, Danielle. Economic empowerment is not just about how much one earns, but also about having control over how that money is spent. Claudia, my understanding is that the Women's Legal Centre, ACT, furthers gender equality by assisting women through the legal system to help them gain their financial independence. How has the pandemic changed the top 2 priorities of the centre, or has it changed the priorities of the centre?
Thanks, Kristen. I wouldn't say it has changed our priorities, but it's definitely given them more urgency and reaffirmed our strategy. So I think, as Alicia said, the pandemic has really highlighted where your gaps are and what's truly necessary. And so the centre prioritises keeping women safe and independent so women can make their own decisions and have choices in life, not just for themselves, but also for their children. So about 80% of the work we do is family law and family violence related. But we also do migration, employment and discrimination, and victims of crime. And what the pandemic has done, what we found, is that our cases are more extreme. So what I mean by that is everything just seems more urgent. Clients are at greater risk. The legal issues are more complex because of the snowball effect of other issues that have been created by COVID. The other parties are harder to negotiate with, so it's harder to get a resolution and get things out of court. There's a lot of anxiety and mental health concerns, and I definitely think that's feeding into the work we're seeing. So it's also created new legal issues that we didn't deal with before. So one that we're definitely seeing a trend with is separated parents arguing about whether their kids should get vaccinated. And what we're seeing, particularly in family violent relationships, that this is yet another avenue for systems abuse and to exercise coercion and control with separated parents. So it's changed to some degree the nature of work, but also it's just intensified a lot of the work we're doing. Women working in women-dominated industries such as disability support, we're seeing that that's created some tension, so unable to continue their jobs because of concerns about their own health or the highly vulnerable cohort in which they serve. And the inability sometimes to comply with work requirements around vaccinations, and there isn't an alternate position to deploy those people to. So we've definitely seen that as a pressure. But I think the increased vulnerability and the effect that's placed on our priorities is the stress that's put particularly on our social work team. So we work within a socio-legal model. So that means that the social workers work really closely with lawyers, and essentially we provide wraparound support to clients. So they have their team, which includes that support. However, this is really time-intensive work. We only have 3 social workers, so we're constantly prioritising and refining what matters we actually have the capacity to take on.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I feel like we've been able to pull so many different ideas from these 3 excellent panelists, and I'm very appreciative that I only asked for 2 because I knew it would rein them in to some degree. If I asked for 4 or 5 or 6, we'd have even more ideas. But thank you, the 3 of you, for those very, very insightful comments. So those of us who evaluate public policies know that they have heterogeneous effects on different groups of the population. So I'd like to move the conversation in that direction to look at some of these particularly disadvantaged groups. The Grattan Institute has done extensive research on the impact of the pandemic on single parents who are predominantly mothers. Danielle, as we enter this COVID normal way of living, what challenges remain and policies are needed to address the needs of this particular group?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you asked about that, because it was, I think, one of the it's not just policy, but the pandemic hit different groups differently. And you mentioned it hit women disproportionately at the start, Kristen, which is exactly right. But single parents in that group, and 90% of them are women, were hit particularly hard. So the employment data was actually pretty shocking. So we were seeing, in periods, particularly when there was lockdowns, employment was down 10 to 15% for single parents. In the first lockdown, paid hours were down 30%. So, that again is partly reflecting the fact that they're disproportionately employed in those sectors that were hardest hit, so things like accommodation and food services. But also, I think, reflects the challenges of care in that world. You said you can't work and have a child at home. That's exactly right. And what do you do when you don't have any other supports? You don't have anyone else to share that with. So we also saw a lot of single parents leaving the workforce. So that's an incredibly hard issue. I was really pleased when the Victorian government responded, albeit fairly late in the piece, but in the final lockdown, single parents were treated the same way as essential workers, so they were still able to utilise care services if they had a job, recognising that fact that they didn't have that opportunity to share. But to me, it was actually such an important reminder of the importance for drilling down and looking at the impacts in different groups and tailoring policy accordingly. But to your question, Kristen, what still needs to happen? I think really we've snapped back to the pre-COVID world in terms of many of the other supports and things that sit around families, which is a world where a third or so of single parent families are living in poverty. That compares to 10% of couple families. It's a world where 20% of those families have to skip essential items, food, electricity. So this is a very real and a very immediate policy challenge. And frankly, the good news is it's one that it's pretty easy to do something about. So the reason why we see those statistics is because many of those families are wholly or partially reliant on government support, so job seeker, parenting payment, rent assistance, and those have not kept pace with community living standards and cost of essentials. So the single biggest thing you can do is to increase the adequacy of those payments. So we can do that overnight with the stroke of a pen. The other thing I would mention, particularly with single parents, is some of the kind of attitudes that make payments hard to access seem particularly heightened when it comes to single parents. So there's a program called Parents Next program. Kind of sounded good when it was rolled out. So kind of transitional support to help single parents get into the workforce, one-on-one support, that all sounds, really great and appropriate. But it kind of became this bit of sort of Frankenstein where, parents have these, they're called participation plans, I think it is, and it includes things like, if you don't take your child to rhyme time at the library or to swimming lessons, you can lose your payments. And it's been quite aggressively enforced, and a lot of parents have been pushed off payments for a period. And if you can already imagine, if you're living below the poverty line and you have children to support and you're cut off from payments, that is a sort of incredibly traumatic experience. So I would like to see a kind of not just a shift in the level of payments, but a movement away from those kind of really punitive measures. And it's certainly been, there's been Senate committees that have recommended this. This is well supported by people that have engaged with the way these programs work. And I would love to see that change.
Thanks, Danielle. Claudia, in an earlier conversation, you mentioned to me that during the pandemic, your family law caseloads initially dropped as lockdowns were imposed. And as women, many of whom were subject to domestic abuse tried to keep the peace in their families till lockdowns were lifted. What do you observe are some of the challenges facing this particular group of your clients? You probably are also, a lot of whom are single moms, but also subject to domestic abuse. As we begin to live with COVID, what are some of the challenges for them that you see?
Yeah. So firstly, the request for advice definitely went up, but as you mentioned, Kristen, it was that ongoing casework. So people were wanting that advice and really thinking about, do I or do I not separate, or what do I do about this immediate crisis situation? But then it was a case of, look, we just need to get through lockdown. Once we get through lockdown, kids will be at school, things will be better, he'll be back at work, there'll be some breathing space. But to answer your question about what's the real challenge for women escaping family violence during COVID, is wanting to separate is how will they be supported to actually execute that decision? So even if you make a decision, as we know, there are so many barriers to going through with that. And we also know from the fallout from the GFC, following periods of recession, family lawyers are very, very busy after points of recession. It's like a tsunami effect with financial stress. And ultimately the impact on relationship breakdown and family violence. So at the moment, we are very, very busy. We do not see that easing at all. People are really ready to make a change in their life. They're accepting that COVID is the new normal. And they say, right, I'm not waiting for the next lockdown or whatever. This is how we're living now. Also, I do question once banks press go on enforcing mortgage arrears, so repossession applications. We're waiting to see the flow and effect from that, and we know that the intersection between family law and bankruptcy make for very complicated property settlements as well. So, which also flows onto one of the biggest challenges, which again isn't new, isn't innovative, isn't exciting, but it's access to long-term affordable housing. I cannot emphasize just how crucial that is to all of this. It's so obvious, the evidence is there, yet nationally we know we're failing on this front, particularly in the ACT. So the priority list for ACT housing, so priority list is at the moment 325 days, so nearly a year to get into priority housing. And if you were on the standard housing list, it's 1,541 days, which is 4.2 years to get into a house. It is insane. If you're a woman with a disability or a woman caring for children with disabilities, it's 10 times harder. So we have a case at the moment where the family is actually at the top of the list, but then housing say we have no suitable stock for you. And so they're just languishing on this list. And then if that's deemed that they're in unsuitable accommodation, then the flow and effect can be care and protection getting involved with your kids if they think the kids are at risk. So you can just see the snowball effect. And when women do not have access to services, appropriate supports as early as possible to prevent these issues, the consequences are devastating.
Thank you, Claudia, for sharing some of those rather shocking statistics. Alicia, individuals not in paid work and those with low incomes who encompass both of the preceding groups we've just discussed interact quite substantially with the tax and transfer system, about which before you were a parliamentarian, you did a fair bit of work on the tax and transfer system. What improvements do you think the tax and are required to the tax and transfer system for these particular groups?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that we've been talking about sole parents, because that is one of the most disadvantaged groups in Australia, with around over a third of sole parent families in poverty, and more likely where the family is headed by a woman, which predominantly sole parent families are. And this predates the pandemic, absolutely. And absolutely, we need to increase the job seeker payment. We have known for way too long that is woefully inadequate, way out of step with community living standards, impossible for people to live on. And we actually had the great example in the pandemic in the government's response when they nearly doubled the job seeker payment through the coronavirus supplement, that we actually saw poverty go down in Australia, even though we were in a recession for the first time in so long. And we also heard anecdotally of people being able to eat properly, get a haircut, do things that they hadn't done for a long time. And I don't think we need to do too much analysis to know that trying to live on $40 a day is not possible. I think that's pretty obvious. And I think ultimately the government delivered a small increase following that. So it's now $43.50 a day. I don't think we needed a lot of analysis to see that that's too low either. We touched on the so number one, we need to increase that. We absolutely need to increase it. But I will touch on the politics of it because I think that is a big problem. Australia prides ourselves on being a fairly egalitarian country, even where we are failing in many areas on that. But part of that is that we have strong wages and traditionally a strong social security system to support people who are not working or not able to work. We're proud of our universal healthcare system. We're proud of public education, but we don't show that sort of national pride in our social security system. It's something that we only ever hear negative things about. And I would say from the Liberal government, there's a lot of demonising of people on social security payments, and we need to change that conversation. We need to talk about the fact that these are some of the social security system is, one of the fundamental pillars of what has helped alleviate and prevent poverty in Australia, and one of the most powerful tools that government has to lift people out of poverty. So, and I acknowledge that my party doesn't have we don't have a plan to increase job seeker at the moment, and that's something that I have and will continue to lobby for. I think, so at the last election, we took a policy to review the job seeker, then New Start payment. And while many, I guess, saw that as a bit of a cop-out, that was never about whether it needed to be increased. It was about looking into exactly by how much and also looking at the indexation and the income testing around that payment and the asset testing. And I think these are really important parts as well. And as someone who, yes, used to do research on the tax and transfer system and worked in that policy area, I think this is incredibly important and I think politics is failing. So I have come around to the idea that ultimately we should have an independent body or, a public service body that recommends on a regular basis what these payments should be at and does it in that way. And the fundamental decider of that rate should be a standard of living measure. And that's a whole other discussion. I think a budget standards approach would be the way to go. But that's, that is why I think this should be left to experts to analyse that data. And part of the reason that I think politically it hasn't happened for us to commit is because there have been so many different numbers floating around of what it should be increased by. But I think everyone can agree that $43.50 a day is inadequate, and you don't need to pull out the Survey of Income and Housing to work that out. The other thing I just quickly say, that is the absolute threshold issue in social security and has been for so long, that it means that other parts of the system are also neglected. And I would say that our family payment system is a really important part of ensuring that single parent families and all families are not in poverty. These payments were originally supposed to be about alleviating child poverty. And they became seen as middle class welfare. And at some point there, early in the Rudd years, I think there was some tightening that was good to happen. But at this point, they're being completely eroded and are no longer serving those objectives. And so that is something that we should look at, I believe. And just quickly, sorry, I know this is a bit of a long answer, but, you know, Bob Hawke, when he said that no Australian child would live in poverty by 1990, that statement has been ridiculed a lot. But what he then did was a bunch of very unsexy measures with family payments and also around child support. And they reduced child poverty by 80%. And this is the power of social security when we get it right. So that issue needs to be something that we look at for gender equality and for equality more generally.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm keen to change the conversation a bit and head in the direction of the gendered impacts of these workplace shortages and the gendered impacts of close contact rules and quarantine. As many of us may have already experienced, in many cases, unexpected close contact with COVID requires quarantine. If a child is a close contact, someone needs to look after them, and that someone is usually or more likely to be a woman. Nationally, this is likely to have a detrimental impact on economic growth, productivity, as well as individual women's career progression. For parents able to work from home, caring for a child who is a close contact is possible, but not very productively, as has already been stated by our panelists, and or not with much sleep. But for those who are unable to work from home, quarantine can result in a loss of income and or employment. This effect is also likely to be amplified if a parent has more than one child exposed to different peers. So this question is for Claudia. As a result of these policies, do you anticipate a rise in unfair dismissal cases among women? And is our legal system equipped to manage these new challenges?
Thanks, Kristen. It's an interesting question. Look, I wouldn't be surprised that if we persevere living with COVID quarantine periods and so forth, that will definitely result in more employment disputes. In terms of unfair dismissals, if a woman is sacked due to having to quarantine with a child or because she herself is sick, I mean, the employer would potentially be in breach of the Sex Discrimination Act, as well as Fair Work legislation. So you can't discriminate on the basis of caring responsibility. So to answer your question, yes, I do think the legal system is equipped in terms of there is a framework. I think there is a separate question about access to justice and who can actually access that system and what supports are in place to do that. I think, though, it's a really interesting question because the murkier territory, particularly in most employment law areas, is once that bridge is burnt with an employer, even if technically, yes, you can stay, it's very hard for the woman to go back into that hostile environment. And so that's why at the centre we focus on early intervention and trying to sort things out before they escalate and focusing on broader policy reform. But another concern is where the employer doesn't necessarily sack the person, but makes the situation so untenable that the woman leaves on her own fruition. There's a question about how much agency is in that decision. So, potential comments about, oh, off again, are we? Or, slight pushback and those, insidious comments, making things really tricky for women. And the comments by Josh Frydenberg about the Great Resignation is a great time for people to change jobs for higher salaries, but not appreciating that particularly for women, it's not just the salary that's valuable, it's the flexibility, people who have been there a long time to earn that flexibility, a workplace which supports their caring duties, a workplace they know is safe, and that's a known quantity. And so we know the true value of employment and adversely the true cost of the loss of employment is the loss of that support network and safety and stability. And I think that's something we really hammer home all the time, is not underestimating how much the workplace is a safety factor in in a woman's safety plan. It is absolutely a circuit breaker, and the workplace plays a huge protective factor. And also not to mention that higher paid roles are just not always there for the picking by women. So I definitely think it could raise a lot of employment issues.
And on those employment issues, I'd like to shift the conversation a bit more to those labor shortages. Danielle, you mentioned or you alluded to the poor working conditions and pay, particularly of those in the care economy. childcare, aged care, and disability care at the beginning of this panel discussion. I was hoping you could talk a bit more about why or what's exacerbated those shortages during COVID. And also in particular, you mentioned that higher pay is needed, but what are the policies or mechanisms that you have in mind to actually allow these workers to get that higher pay?
Yeah, it's a great question. So look, there's the shortage issue, there's a structural issue in some of these sectors, which was the point I was making before, that they're just not able at current pay and conditions to attract and retain enough people. And you could see in the childcare data I'm most familiar with, but pre-COVID there was lots of centres applying, not to meet the normal caring ratios and things because they just didn't have enough workers. What's happened in COVID is we've made these jobs a lot more high pressure. So that they're dealing, like the degree of difficulty, particularly in aged care, when all of a sudden you're donning, PPE and you're having to worry about, yourself catching COVID, the people you're looking after catching COVID. These are just, and you've got staff off or being rostered off, and so you're working extra hours and all of that. So, these sectors, particularly aged care, have had an incredibly difficult period. And there are so many workers in those sectors that are looking around, they're paid poorly, and they can go and frankly have a much easier job elsewhere for higher pay. So it's no surprise that many, even if they love the work, are making the decision to step back from that. But that is a very significant long-term issue that we're going to have to grapple with. Demand for these services is going up. And we need a workforce that is there to support them. So, in a normal market, we would expect to see pay rise to meet those shortages. These obviously don't function entirely like normal markets. They're mixed markets. You've got private providers, but the majority of money comes from government. I think we can't ignore the fact that there have been some I think the gendered nature of the fact that 90% of these employees are women, they're doing care work, has fed through into the poor paying conditions that we see realised in these sectors. So on the question of what needs to happen, it's not straightforward, Kristen, because these services aren't directly provided by government. It's not a matter of saying we're just going to pay them more, like you might with teachers and state governments, for example. But there are some mechanisms. So through the Fair Work Commission, there's the opportunity for sectors to put forward a case for equal pay, or make a case that the sector has been not treated equally because of the gendered nature of the workforce. The aged care sector has such a case before the Fair Work Commission at the moment. Governments can intervene in those cases, which is really just putting in a submission, but being clear that they would support the pay rises via higher payments to providers. That is important for commissioners at the Fair Work Commission, because it shows that those, if they were to grant the pay rise, they're going to be able to be met. So that is actually a really important mechanism. So that the current government could intervene, and that was something that the Aged Care Royal Commission recommended, I think. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure they certainly recognised that the pay and conditions were insufficient, and that the Fair Work case had merit. And so, that is something that governments could do right away that would make a difference. If the aged care case is successful, I expect you would see similar. There has been a childcare case in the past, but I think it would return in a similar form to the aged care case. So there are things that governments can do. It's not simple and it's not direct, but overall, I think that would flow through to higher wages, and ultimately, that's the only long-term way we're going to be able to solve these issues with staff shortages.
And we started off with the conversation talking a lot about paid parental leave and childcare. And so as my last question before turning it over to the audience to take some of their questions, I have a question about childcare for Alicia. Improved pay and working conditions are one way of attracting more workers, as Danielle has eloquently described, but they're also a labor cost, as she also very eloquently described. Higher wages in the childcare sector are likely to lead to higher costs for parents, which obviously has flow-on effects for labor supply of women. Lower childcare fees and higher wages would obviously be a boon for labor force participation. So Alicia, my question to you is how we actually get there.
Yeah, great question. And certainly workers in the childcare sector are very much underpaid and undervalued in the incredibly important professional work that they are doing. My personal view is that ultimately current childcare system is not really working. Governments are spending quite substantial money on the subsidies, yet parents are still finding it unaffordable and in many cases inaccessible, the hours and days that they want. The workers are underpaid and the providers have a very low profit margin. So something is not working there. And my personal view is that ultimately we should make it part of the school system and manage it in that way. And that's something I've written about before. And it would also change the way that we view childcare when we know so much about the benefits of early learning for our youngest Australians, that we sort of separate it as this, you know, school is a free state-run institution, whereas childcare is, yes, in this situation where it's a mixture and there's government subsidies and the problems I mentioned before. So I think that a lot of those issues would be solved if the whole thing was managed more like a school, and therefore teachers would be paid in the way, you know, in a more reliable way. And part of our policy, I should say too, so Labor has a policy on childcare which would make childcare more affordable for 90% of families. And part of our policy as well is that in government we would refer to the Productivity Commission to look at a universal 90% subsidy. And so that is essentially looking at making childcare almost free universally, and so therefore changing it to more like school, as I mentioned. And I think that is a really exciting part of that policy, because I do believe ultimately that is where we need to go. In the shorter term though, as Danielle was talking about with aged care workers, it's another area where governments can put a submission to the Fair Pay Commission and back it up with, yes, exactly as you say, that these that those higher wages will be able to be met. And part of Labor's policy for closing the gender wage gap is also empowering the Fair Pay Commission the Fair Work Commission to have a greater power to order pay increases in female-dominated industries, which childcare, early childhood education and care is clearly one.
Thank you, Alicia, and a big thanks to all three of our panelists. We've got some interesting questions from the audience, which I'll put to some of our speakers. First, we've got a question for Claudia. Claudia, one of the issues for women leaving family violence is having somewhere safe to go, as you already mentioned. But I guess, is there currently the framework is the woman and her children need to leave the home? And this person is asking, can we somehow make it work in the opposite direction, as in getting the perpetrators removed from the family home so that they're the ones that the family can actually stay in the home?
Yep. So we definitely look at that option, of course, as a first option. The issue, there's two main issues. So one, we know a family violence order, what they're called in the ACT, can be quickly issued. They're served on the other party by police, and that is a very quick way to get somebody out of the house. However, what that does is potentially increase risk to the woman. And so we know the point of separation is one of the highest points of risk for a woman when she's facing separation, even if there's an order in place. And that there's a separate question there about, you know, the utility of orders if they're not going to be enforced properly and consistently as well. So there's definitely a policing discussion there. Secondly, it's a very short-term solution. So the issue is that long-term housing security, because particularly if you're separating, you've gone from 2 incomes to 1. And so this is where the stressor is, in that you have a 2-income household who is in the private rental sector. You separate, suddenly the woman doesn't have enough money to maintain that rent. And so she has to find alternate accommodation in any event, or even being able to maintain mortgage repayments. So sometimes in those situations, we do seek spousal maintenance, there might be child support payable, but it's not enough to sustain what was a 2-income household. So that there's a lot of complexities there, but absolutely it's an option that we'll always look at.
Thank you, Claudia. Leonora has a question to the broader, all three of you, and any of you can feel free to take it. Are there any specific issues where policymakers and practitioners are seeking more or better analysis, evidence, and evaluation from researchers and economists? I guess we'll start with that as the first question, and then she has a few follow-ons.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think there is a huge role for researchers and research economists to be crunching the numbers on a whole lot of things. I think the gendered impact of policy is something that we're hearing a lot more about now, which is fantastic, but we really need to kind of integrate that analysis as standard, as part of processes. So, I mean, I was pretty critical of I'm going to say the October 2020 budget, the first kind of post-COVID budget in 2020, because of the kind of gendered nature of all the direct industry supports were effectively flowing to male-dominated industries that were less hard hit, and very little to the female-dominated sectors that were hit much harder. And when I asked people in Treasury, had they done any kind of gender analysis of this, the answer was no, which is pretty extraordinary. I suspect that would have changed, and I've found Treasury actually really open to discussions of this. So this is not intended as a criticism of them, but I think it was actually the external researchers crunching these numbers, and groups like the National Foundation for Australian Women, who put out a report after each budget, have been really pivotal. Ideally, we would go back to a world where you have a sort of gender budget statement that does these cuts and actually kind of feeds into the policy making process. But while that's not in place, I think external researchers have and continue to play a really important role. The other thing I think is extremely valuable from external researchers is these more recognising these sort of groups that couldn't be particularly disadvantaged. So, we talked about single parents, but people with disability, just low SES, cold background. It's harder to get data, and you start hitting up against sample size issues. But I think looking out for ways in which economic circumstances or policy might be hitting particular groups harder is really valuable. And I think governments are responsive when it's brought to their attention. So they're keep doing what you're doing, Leonora. I think you personally have done a great job on the gender analysis, and I think many others have too. And I think it does actually make a difference to policy.
Can I jump in? I have a whole bunch that it's always been the wish list at the back of my mind for years. So the low-hanging fruit would be a cost-benefit analysis of supporting legal services to provide access to justice. So there's some pretty outdated data. I think that if for every $1 you spend on a community legal centre, you get a $4 return. I actually think it would be much higher, particularly if you quantified community legal centres which do a bit more advocacy and litigation work, which is quite a more modern approach to community legal centres traditionally, and the cost of keeping matters out of court. There is a huge cost-benefit analysis just waiting for someone with the right skills and brain. So I'm more than happy to be contacted by Keen Beans, because this is something that is just so obvious, and to me would be low-hanging fruit. The other would also be, this is a bit more ambitious, costing, what does a trauma-informed community service look like, and the cost benefits of that. And so what I mean by that, if we completely redesigned our systems, particularly the intersection between health, legal, education, employment, housing, and took a really trauma-informed approach in a really disciplined way, and there's a whole study about what is trauma-informed system and service design, I think there would also be huge cost benefits there, because it's all based upon prevention. and early intervention, which we're always seem to be dealing in the crisis end of things, which makes things 10 times more complicated and 100 times more expensive. So that's probably a PhD, I think, that the other one might be a bit more manageable, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. For politicians, independent research from economists and researchers that we can use to make some of these arguments is so valuable. And just following on from what Claudia said, I think one of the nuts that is so hard to crack is the benefits of policies rather than just the costs, and the second round effects in budgets. And the way that we report budgets is so it has such an impact on the policies that are made and agreed to. If we could show the impact of increasing social security payments in what it saves, all that money goes back into our economy. We know that, but also what it saves in terms of health costs and other costs. And that applies to so many policies across policy areas across the board. If someone could come up with a way of doing a budget that captured all of that, that would be incredibly helpful. And having said before, that we don't need any research to show that people can't live on $43 a day, it's still good to have it. and also, yeah, looking at, and I know a lot of this has been done, but always more is good around those sorts of budget standards approaches. What should the payment be? A really strong independent number on that would be really helpful.
Thank you all. I had one additional question for Alicia, based on the last comment you said, that Labour is proposing to have a plan that funds, that makes, what did you say, 90%, that covers 90% of the cost of childcare? 90% is a lot. Why not go all the way? Like, what's the 10% that's not included?
Yes, that's a good question. So that, our policy isn't actually to deliver that; it's to get the Productivity Commission to look into that. So just to be clear there. But the way we have talked about that is like universal childcare. So I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure why we didn't go with 100%, but maybe there is a view that people should contribute something. But I think that if that review happened, I hope that it would look at that more broadly as well, both those things. So our policy though is to, will lift the subsidy rate. Sorry, it does lift the maximum rate to 90%, and 90% of families will be better off, and it will increase the subsidy for all families earning less than $530,000. So it's very much across the income scale, that again, almost universal. And that was probably just a budgeting thing, that it didn't go quite that far. But we see this very much as a measure that doesn't need to be means tested. It is about a universal policy for families to be able to access early learning, and parents to be able to join the workforce and increase their workforce participation. So it's not seen as a measure that is targeted at lower income people.
I think, yes, I think that's right. It's a total change in mindset to thinking of this as sort of a sort of economic measure as opposed to a welfare measure. Just on the, like, maybe the 90% question, there's an argument that you do want to retain a small co-payment because it's not compulsory to send your kids. So what you don't want is parents kind of sitting on a spot. So I'll just book my child in for the whole year and just drop him or her when it's convenient. Like a small copay kind of means that parents will only use it when they need to. But you obviously need to set it at a level where it's not going to be prohibitive from certain people engaging, and probably 10%, might be $5 a day or something. Sort of trying to strike that right balance.
Fantastic. Well, that brings us to 4:29, nearly 4:30 at the end of our session. It just seems to have flown by, and I just want to take the opportunity once again to thank all of the panelists. Your contributions were invaluable to helping us better understand what lies ahead as we approach, as we start to learn and adapt to live with this virus. I'd also like to thank all of the participants for their participation here in the Policy Symposium and over the course of the last couple of days. And with that, we look forward to seeing everyone, hopefully in person, in Perth, at the Australian Gender Economics Workshop in 2023. Thank you all, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks, everyone.